Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. The escalation of violence that we've seen and of course Israel's subsequent military response that has intensified regional tensions. We've also seen of course the threat of this conflict potentially widening. We'll be talking about that. Of course, Iran has also called for a Security Council meeting. The ramifications of this on overall, of course, Middle East, the tensions in the area, and what this means for, of course, the world at this time when we are looking at this conflict, when we are looking at those that come out in support of Palestine all over the world. And when we look at these offensives that are continuing as far as Israel is concerned, what do we expect from, for example, the UN Security Council, if anything? What do we expect overall? Whether there can be a change of dynamics, so to speak, that can translate into a real solution for the Palestinian people. All of that today on Perspective. I have with me JAUHAR SALEEM, who's a former Foreign Secretary, President IRS. Thank you for being with us today. We have with us NADER ALTURK, who's Deputy Head of Mission Embassy of the State of Palestine. Thank you for joining us today. And Dr. AHMED ZAKI, who is an expert on Middle East. Thank you for joining us today. George, we were talking about the fact that, of course, there's a very real threat of this escalating now, and we've also, again, Iran and its own, as far as the equation overall in the Middle East is concerned, the offensives that are continuing from the Israel side that we are seeing, the call for a Security Council meeting. Do you think it's signifies anything real? Do you think that it can garner a real response, or you think that it will be perhaps something that will again mean really nothing for the people of Palestine?
Yeah, the situation is definitely getting graver by the day, and it's very unfortunate because at the end of the day, it's the innocent people which are suffering. Now, what we see in Lebanon, for instance, after this very heavy bombardment. The multiple strikes that have taken place, 1 million people in Lebanon have been displaced, and hundreds of thousands are now living without basic amenities. This is almost similar to what was happening in Gaza, although in Gaza the situation is much more dire. But in terms of the numbers affected, this is not a small number anymore. Now, the other dimension of this situation, the evolving situation, is that now we are close to about a year of the start of the inception of this invasion by the Israelis, the military action by the Israelis, which has been, we have seen, one of the most brutal in living memory, and also which has really resulted in more than 44,000 deaths so far. And if you talk about Lebanon, then the deaths would have definitely crossed the figure of 45,000 now. But the real threat is that what if the conflict widens? And that is something that the Americans in the West and the other powers involved in the region, for instance, the Egyptians, the Qataris, the Jordanians, whoever had been involved in the diplomacy there, Saudis, they all had been endeavoring to prevent that. And Americans in particular, because they did not want that. So initially what they had managed was when this Hamas-Israel war started getting more intense, they had tried successfully to, that another front on the Hezbollah side did not open. And Hezbollah had shown extreme restraint. The Western analysts, of course, always take Hezbollah as an Iranian proxy. So going by their logic, Iran had shown a great deal of restraint as well. And then there were the actions by Israel, repeated actions by Israel, which would have brought upon a direct Iran-Israel confrontation, which happened as well to some extent. But because of the restraint shown by Iran, because of the preventative diplomacy, very intense diplomacy, the shuttle diplomacy, we know that, so many times Blinken has been to this region, other US officials, the president of the US has been involved, all these countries, Jordan, Qatar, Egyptians, the back channel diplomacy has been so hectic. Okay, that prevented the widening of the conflict. But now it seems that Israel is confident enough that it can handle a two-front situation. So it has opened this front in a very brutal manner, as we've seen.
You think that then, you're saying really essentially that things have gotten worse because Israel and its offensives have gotten bolder. And of course, we've seen that in Lebanon. We've seen that also, in the recent offensive by Israel. Let me come back to you. I'll include Nader in this also. Nader, if you heard what JAUHAR SALEEM is saying, there is clearly the inability of the world powers, the inability of those that seem to matter to contain this conflict is quite stark. In that kind of a situation now, what would you expect in the next couple of months?
Assalamu alaikum. First, I like to send on behalf of my people, behalf of my leadership, our deep condolence for our Lebanese brothers and sisters, which are suffering because they are supporting Palestine, because they are defending Palestine. And we bleeding together since long time. We was together in war in 1982, facing the Israelis together, and again, we are facing the Israelis together. And we continue our struggle until Palestine and Aqsa are independent and free and open for all humanity to sharing us our victory. First of all, I hear my brother Saleem, His Excellency Saleem, what he's speaking about. But when you speak about Americans and Blinken's visits to our region, actually he came with Israel's vision to discuss it with other parties, and what was not acceptable, because he came to our area as a Jew, not representing even the policy of United States of America, and he proud to be a Jew more than he proud that he is a foreign minister of United States of America. I think he feels that as a Jew is greater. Second, was Mr. Blinken he came always with full support for the Israelis' lies, Israelis' visions, Israelis' criminal actions against humanity, and he looking for the Israelis when they do that as a victims, when the Palestinians are the criminals. So according to that, he didn't succeed, and he will never succeed to reach to any acceptable point for the all parties until he going back to international resolution, international law, and obey and follow it. This is the problem of Mr. Blinken and the Americans' leadership. What we are waiting for, actually, we're waiting for activate the international law. We are looking for activate the international resolutions to make all the countries around the world obey it. First of all, Israelis and Americans. Second, we are waiting for making system around the international society more fair and giving same and equal rights for all the nations, not ignore nations in favor of other nations, like they are doing.
I want to, on that point,
in favor of Israel.
I think you raise a very fair point. Let me come back to you. I want to explore this a little bit with Dr. Ahmed ZAKI also. Dr. Ahmed, if you heard what Nader is saying, I think that, he's talking, of course, of something that we all want, more equality, more, there being some sort of balance. And correct me if I'm wrong, he would, that kind of balance that has to exist between nations for there not to be the situation that we are in, where people, of course, we are looking at the kind of massacre that's happening in Palestine. There's no other word for it. But do you think it's realistic? And I have to think about it from that point of view. That do you think it's realistic to expect that kind of a balance to exist in the world of today, where Israel is doing what it's doing, where America and we have to at least accept has been unable, even if, you know, if we say that they've tried to contain this conflict, the attempts that have been made?
Thank you for having me. And as you know, the Middle East crisis, it's not a new crisis which started in this year. It intensified after the October 7 when Hamas captured the Israeli hostages, and in response, Israelis have destroyed complete Gaza, make a genocide in that area, and a lot of innocent civilians have been massacred by the Israeli army. That shows that the shifting balance of power in Middle East, that Middle East, they have clarified their intentions clearly, that they are no longer going to be dependent in one power. After that, Saudi Arabia and Iran have some sort of understanding, the power of the Middle East completely shifted. And this is where Israel is feeling insecurity, that they want Americans still have the ultimate power in Middle East with the support of Israel. And that's why they are trying American armies go to a war in the Middle East against Iran, so that the power of the Israeli influence in the Middle East could remain sustained. On the other hand, Israelis are trying to have a good relations with Saudi Arabia, regardless of the conditions that Saudi Arabia have put, that Palestine should have to have an independent state with Israel. And that is where Israel is feeling that if American troops did not invade in the Middle East conflict and did not fight side by side against Iran or against the Iranian support militants, this is where Israel is facing that for the next 10 years, they will not remain in the same power balance that they are dominating the rest of the countries. And Arab countries, they remain uninvolved into the war, trying to make it diplomatic solutions with Israel, but Israel tries to make always, as they were involved in the American war in Iraq, and they were involved in American armies in Syria, they want also American armies to involve in Lebanon and against Iran too. So this is where they are trying to make the balance of power to sustain. But as American troops have failed a lot of times in Iraq, they fail also in Afghanistan, humiliated by Taliban. Now they cannot carry out in their back without the benefit of American people, that they will still remain slave for Israelis and make war for the benefit of Benjamin Netanyahu. And that is where the balance of power is shifting.
Right. Mr. Saleem, do you agree with what Dr. Ahmed is saying? I mean, of course, you know, the balance of power that he talks about, the question is, can we get, you know, the world to play fair? I mean, let's put it simply.
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the fact is, we have to remember, like, you know, international politics has never abided by any international laws or international sort of, you know, like public opinion or any tenets or principles or ideals. We all pay a great deal of lip service to that. When I say all, I mean the big powers, you know, the Western powers and the other important powers in the world. But at the end of the day, it's all an interplay of interests and power games. And that is the unfortunate reality of international politics. And sometimes when we don't understand the complexities involved, then, you know, like there are missteps. And those missteps can lead to a lot of devastation. Now, in this situation that we have presently, first of all, one has to see whether Hamas, because if their objective was to bring the Palestinian statehood issue to the forefront, because it had, I mean, quite frankly, it had gone to a back burner with the signing of Abraham Accords and all that process that had been gaining strength. One after another, the countries had been normalizing relations with Israel, Arab countries, that is. And there was even talk that the Saudis were sort of, you know, having some sort of a dialogue as per the media reports. Now, if that was their objective, Now, the objective had been achieved, but at what cost? I mean, there's been bloodbath there.
Yeah.
45,000 people killed. The whole Gaza has been changed into a rubble.
Yeah.
And now what is happening on the other side? Because what it has done is, it has given Netanyahu, who was besieged politically in his own country, and who was under a great deal of pressure because of not just politically, he had lost the popularity, he had court cases against him, and in fact there was a big impending this threat that whenever he loses power, he'll probably end up in jail. So he got, in a way, a great opportunity to basically, this is the type of war that he was probably looking for. Now, what he's trying to do is, he's, first of all, despite, and I would say that, despite the utmost endeavors of the Americans to have some sort of a ceasefire in collaboration with the other Arab countries involved in the negotiations, the Americans have failed so far. And that is because of the intransigence of Netanyahu, because he's just thinking about his political survival. He doesn't care at all about tens of thousands of people being killed, the whole region around him being devastated. And he's opening new fronts. And he is trying to show to his people that, look, this is what I can do for you. I can assassinate Hassan Nasrallah. I can assassinate Ismail Haniyeh. I can assassinate the second-tier leadership, the third-tier leadership. You see, these are for him, these are unfortunately, sadly, these are trophies for him. And this is what he's showing to, basically to the people, to the public in Israel. Whether it works or not, it's another question. But the thing is, this is clearly his strategy to widen the conflict to an extent where people in Israel would think that he's indispensable. And as it is said always that all politics is domestics, and the foreign policy that countries exercise, a lot of times it has a very deep imprint of personalities. And right now, what we see is Netanyahu's imprint on this policy, which is unfortunately not only destabilizing that region, resulting in massacres and brutality of utmost proportions, but also threatening the world peace.
Now that you agree with what Mr. Saleem is saying, that it's really domestic as far as Israel is concerned, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, and that it stems from his own internal situation, the internal politics, the domestic politics of Israel.
I respect my brother's opinion, but I like to explain one thing. And I don't know if you follow the statement done by President Biden, American president, when he congratulated and welcomed the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, may Allah bless his soul, by the Israelis. And he said he paid the price for his crimes. Here, I like to ask a question to Mr. Biden as a president of the United States of America. If one of his pilots on one of the Americans' aircraft carriers in the region use his F-35 airplane and attack Israelis meeting in Knesset Parliament and kill all the Israelis leader, and as a punishment for their crimes in Gaza and Lebanon, he going to have the same statement, or what he going to do? This is first. Second, how become what is the opinion of the international organization, the United Nations, when by Mr. Netanyahu giving the green light to use 85 Jadam bombs against civilians' neighborhood to kill only one person? Thousands and injured and killed in that attack include the target was the Israelis looking for. So what is the United Nations said about that, using their building to giving such order like this, to make this such crime like this authorized from their building, which is need to be the light for all the humanity of, for human rights and international resolution, international law to be obey and support. How become such order like this going out their building to kill someone with many of his people without give him opportunity to have justice by facing a court? This is one of the questions. They are doing same in Gaza. They kill hundreds of Palestinian leaders like Yasser Arafat, Abu Iyad, Abu Jihad, and Abu Ali Mustafa. They attacked him in Ramallah during he was in his office, and this was making his people, his stuff in danger. This is the Israelis' policy. What does the international community say about that issue? Something else, what is the options, what we can do? We still have the strength to do many things as a humanity. We have the right to campaign together, hand by hand, to be united against the Israelis' crimes against humanity, against American support for Israelis' crimes, against any country continue supporting the Israelis in their crimes, and against any country going and act against the international law. We still, as a humanity, have the power. Or the future of the region going to be this. The Israelis going to be their greater country by occupying many and many countries around. What was the speech of the Israelis energy minister? He said, after this, what we have in Lebanon right now, we are looking for a weakness point of the agreement with Lebanon about our sea borders to see how we can change it, how we can damage it, to control the Lebanese gas fields in the Mediterranean Sea. This is how the Israelis act. They are only looking for looting other people's lands like they do for our people, for Palestine, and they are looking to looting other people, natural resources that they do in my country. They are looking for the Lebanese land, Lebanese resources, Jordanian land, Jordanian resources, Egyptian land, Egyptian resources, Syria land and Syrian resources, Saudi Arabia land, Saudi Arabia resources, and who knows who going to be there.
Let me go. I agree with what you're saying. There's no two opinions on trying to, the various options that you outline. But let's go into some detail on how feasible or how practical those options are. Nobody, everybody is watching the massacre. Everybody is watching the way the offensives one after the other. And like Mr. SALEEM here said,
international law to be obeyed and be followed. This is very simple issue. We have a lot of international organization costing humanity a lot of money to make this in progress. Just let them work, do what they are establishing for. They need to follow international law, international procedure, following the international organization, following the order of ICG, ICT. This is what we need to do. This is what the humanity needs to do.
Let me go to Dr. Ahmed Zaki. Dr. Ahmed, do you agree with what Nader is saying? Of course, those are the options, those are the solutions. But the question is rather, it's not as simplistic. It's about how do we get there, and how do we exercise those options? How do we enforce those options? And that's really the simple question here.
As you know, this is the similar stories that how the Second World War have started by appeasing the interests and the ability that Germany was having to influence in the small countries in Europe, while the powers which can challenge the authority of Hitler on that time, they were very skeptical, so that they should not involve themselves into a wider conflict by trying to minimize the conflict into between the Germany and the small states in Europe. But later on, we know how it affected every country across the world and how it became a catastrophe. Now, the similar abusing tactics have been given by the Netanyahu, while the European Union, majority of the European people and the majority of American public are regularly protesting more than any other country in the world, including the Muslim countries. But democracy have failed, because when it came to the actual power belongs to the lobbies, those who have extreme power in America, that they can challenge any authority exist in America, including the president. President cannot go against any lobbies who are financing all the American politicians and forcing to do whatever they want. And this is a game of earning. This is how American gun lobbies, they are producing millions of ammunition and thousands of different type of weapons, and Palestinians become a library test that they are testing their weapons on the people and then resell it into Paris or France. This is how they are making billions of dollars. And those who are going to purchase is the neighbors of Israel, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Middle East countries. So here is how they are making and milking the big money in the Middle East. On the other hand, by ignoring the international law, doing whatever you want to do, it has a severe consequences that nobody will ever appreciate in the coming years. It's not only going to affect in Israel or Palestine or Arabs between Arabs and Israel, it's going to affect every nation across the world, particularly those who are having a power today in Europe and Western countries. And it will come back the same scenario, or might be worse than that scenario that we have seen in the Second World War.
Right. Let me come to you. Jauhar, there's, you heard what Dr. Ahmed Zaki is saying. Of course, that's the concern. That's what we're talking about. That's the concern, that we want to contain it. It should be contained. It shouldn't spread. And that, I think, is where, the energies are centered. But the question again, as far as the legal options are concerned, international law options are concerned, in terms of mediation, in terms of, having powers like the US play their role, there seems to be a deadlock there, right? So my question really is that if you talk about options at this time, the pressure of the people also is not enough to get, for example, the US to play that role. So, and you have maintained that, perhaps the US wants, there to be, I mean, I'm not saying whether they do or not, but the question is that the world does not want to see it spread, right?
I've been maintaining that. I think it is not, and it was not in the US interest that this conflict spread. It was not in the US interest that this brutality, this massacre continues. Because you see, US relies upon, amongst a lot of things, goodwill of many countries in the world as a superpower. And US always relies upon its soft power, which probably the other superpowers, such as Soviet Union, never had to that extent. So that soft power we have seen has been really injured because of this crisis. But what we have also seen is that, 2 or 3 very important points here. One, that the international public opinion crystallized, and we saw to an unprecedented scale that international public opinion being expressed by the people, by those hundreds of thousands of demonstrators in European countries and Muslim countries everywhere in the world, by the leaderships of so many countries in the world, ranging from Latin America to Europe to Middle East to Asia, everywhere in the world. Then we saw in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, of course, there were very clear resolutions and sort of the international public opinion being expressed. But we also saw in the United Nations Security Council a body which was precisely set up, established to prevent and resolve conflicts, totally failing. Although the United Nations resolutions were passed, first they failed because of American veto, but eventually America relented and the resolutions were passed. But despite that, and despite the ICJ rulings, which were very clear and categorical as well subsequently, initially they were slightly ambivalent. And then, of course, in the ICC, with all that process, despite all that, Israel has just ignored the world opinion, the public opinion, the pressure by all the countries, the pressure by the Americans, whatever happened in the United Nations system, ICJ, which is part of the United Nations system, and ICC, which is not. So, number one, what we see here is the return of literally the Peloponnesian type of politics, where power is the only game in town. like Mao Zedong said once, that the power stems from the barrel of a gun, you know. So it's that type of a situation. Total disregard of any international norms, international laws and all that. And it has been rightly pointed out that this architecture, you know, League of Nations failed for this very reason, because the strong countries were able to bulldoze, you know, their sort of, you know, they impose their will on the weak countries, and the League of Nations couldn't do anything. Right. And because of that, it failed, and then they brought forward this architecture, which was much more sophisticated, much improved. But that has failed as well. We see that now. So quite clearly, number one, there's a need for sort of, you know, of course, some sort of a reform of this system, right. Reform of international political architecture as well, because the United Nations, you know, because the West always talks about the rule-based international order. So the rules-based international order is not working. Then again, what we saw, the second point, the failure of diplomacy, very intense diplomacy. You know, I'm very convinced that it was. Particularly, it was not in the interest of President Biden, who was facing a re-election, you know, and he had to eventually drop out. And I think part of the reason, amongst other things, you know, his health and whatever, was that he was sort of, you know, he was seen as having failed, you know, to contain Israel. And a lot of vote of the Democratic Party comprises the Arab Americans, the Muslim Americans, the young, the women, you know, people who were kind of, you know, were more sympathetic to what was happening to the Palestinians there. So that, you know, it's actually impacted upon the US politics as well. So that diplomacy failed as well. It's still ongoing, of course, you know, they haven't really lost hope, but we've seen it faltering, you know. Americans have recently started another diplomacy to have some sort of a, you know, back channel, you know, to come up with some sort of a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. Of course, you know, in parallel, the diplomacy for the shuttle diplomacy for having some sort of a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel is ongoing. But for so far, it hasn't really succeeded, despite very many attempts and despite so many countries getting involved. So that is the other thing. The third thing, and the last one that I want to mention here, you know, this is something, in technically speaking, this is asymmetric warfare, you know. Okay. Now, in asymmetric warfare, what we used to see before, and this asymmetric warfare used to happen in terms of wars of liberation or wars of resistance and sort of, you know, many different ways. But in that, the collateral damage was a very important factor. Okay. And that in some ways was a leveling factor. Because first of all, there was such a great asymmetry or disparity of the power on both sides. But because of the fear of collateral damage, the superior power, which was overwhelmingly superior, would have some regard and sort of, you know, like the conflict would not be, they wouldn't really just bulldoze with all their power the other side to an extent that there would be a massacre. The other thing was the technological superiority, which was there, but it seems to me now, and it seems, I think a lot of analysts are saying that the technological superiority has advanced to the level, you know, what happened with all those walkie-talkies exploding and all that sort of, you know, like the pages exploding, and now, you know, the leadership being hit in so many countries, whether it was in Iran, whether it was in Lebanon, whether it was in sort of, you know. So I think that is going to change the sort of the nature of asymmetric warfare in future as well. But at the, you know, at the end of the day, I think what the world needs to see now, what the people are clamoring everywhere in the world, is at least a temporary halt to this massacre, this brutality which is ongoing. And for that, I think greater pressure from the Muslim world, greater pressure from all the countries involved is needed, because whatever pressure had been sort of, you know, like aimed at Israel so far seems to have not really worked.
Nader, at the end of the day, I think, you know, it's really about increasing pressure and how much pressure can be levied against, you know, the kind of atrocities that we are seeing. And, you know, whether we can get, as the world can really get Israel to cave under that pressure. We've seen the world come out, we've seen, again, you know, I guess when we talk about, like you mentioned, we talk about international law options, we talk about the failure of the UN Security Council, we've seen, you know, the countries like South Africa play their role. There's no denying how, you know, in some cases we've also seen the world stand with Palestine. But like you also mentioned, more unity. Do you think that we are moving towards that kind of unity against, you know, the oppression by Israel now? The world is going to unite against that?
I'm sure about that soon, inshallah, we'll see humanity in one side and Americans leaders with Israelis in the other side. Americans' future is leaders, I speak not about the people, still acting as a slave for the Zionists. This is that we are acting according to that they only serve the Israelis' opinion, Israelis' lies, Israelis' propaganda, and support day by day by more and more whooping the Israelis to kill more and more Palestinians yesterday and today, Palestinians and Lebanese. This is what the Americans act. What is the humanity? International community, human rights organizations, public opinions. All the people of the world are against the Israelis and against the American support for the Israelis. This is what is happening right now. Only we need to invest in that public opinion to make it more organized, more courage, to be not afraid of being anyone told them that you're anti-Semitic when are against the Israelis, to make it very clear. When you are against Israeli crimes, you are not against Jew, because the Jews themselves are against Israeli crimes. So we need to use this public opinion.
Let me take Dr. Ahmed's opinion on this. When Nader talks about, perhaps organizing more and, levying that pressure, how do we do that, Dr. Ahmed? How do we, let's talk about this. How do we move towards getting more organized in terms of levying that kind of pressure that will make a country like Israel cave? How do we become more, again, organized? How do we become, how does the world unite? How do we make that kind of move towards uniting the world, in your opinion?
Unless we understand the actual power of Israel, it will be difficult to make any organization against them, because Israel have not by themselves their own military power or political power or any influence in the Middle East without the help of America. So American power is directly involved, and they are subject for anyone who go against Israel, including any Muslim or any other nuclear power who go against them. It's 100% sure that America is going to go against that country, whether it's Russia, European Union, Muslim countries, or any other country that have some sort of power to challenge America. So we should have to understand challenging Israel is directly challenging United States. So in order to understand that American interests in the Middle East should have to have a lot of consequences, so that they should have to force Israel to stop what they are doing in the Middle East. And that only can do by the oil production producing countries like OPEC countries can put American pressure against Israel. And the only thing that they can do against America is that they have to compromise the American interests in the Middle East, particularly those interests that American military basis in the Arab countries should have to give an order that without putting pressure of Israel, you are no longer welcome here and you should have to leave our country as soon as possible. So if they put some sort of a diplomatic pressure from there, it will be easy that to Israelis on the table.
Let me take Jauhar Saab's opinion on this also.
We've seen in the past, of course, in the 70s, there was the oil embargo, the famous oil embargo. And it worked to a certain extent. But, right now, the possibility of having something like that, because now OPEC has gone much bigger, and there are countries other than Arab countries which are involved in that. But the fact is the Arabs, Saudi Arabia has come up with a new initiative. And that initiative, I think, could be useful. They're trying to build a coalition of not just Muslim countries, but including some European countries as well, exactly for this very purpose. Because, you see, unless you're organized, that pressure has to be, so far the pressure has been there from all sides, of course, but it has fallen short. So what do? You don't give up, you try to organize better and have a sustained pressure. At some point in time, of course, the Israelis, they won't be able to withstand that much pressure, and perhaps there would be some restraint shown from their side. But I also pin some hopes on the diplomacy that the Americans are carrying out. And I think, the two tracks.
But I think where you and Dr. Ahmed Zaki disagree is that you and or maybe Nader disagree is that he's talking about levying pressure on the Americans, and you are talking about the Americans levying pressure on Israel.
Yeah, exactly. I think on that we have to be very clear. First of all, I've maintained that in America there's a bipartisan support for Israel. There's no doubt about that. Again, Israel's security is a cornerstone of the U.S. foreign policy. So that these are like, this is nothing kind of, like which is hidden or anything. This is a very open public U.S. stance. That is clear. But at the same time, when there's some ruthless actions, some outrageous actions taken by Israel's leadership, and Netanyahu has been doing that in particular, sometimes in disregard of the U.S. Political opinion, sometimes in contravention of what the U.S. leadership wants. Because you see, I think that...
To put it simply, you're saying that the U.S. has to think about its own image. It has to think about,
course,
at the end of the day, what it means and how it makes them look to the world.
Exactly. You cannot equate Israel and U.S. Because you see, the U.S. supports Israel. It's security. There's a bipartisan support. The U.S., the Jewish lobby in America is very strong. It's all there. But at the same time, you can't. There's no way that you can say that the two countries are synonymous in terms of their policies, because it is very clear that it is not in the U.S. interest right now that this conflict spreads. For instance, it is not in the U.S. interest now that there are more killings there, and like what is happening. And I think they have been trying, because it's in their interest. They have been trying
to contain
their best to contain it, number one, and secondly, to have some sort of a ceasefire.
Right.
And they will probably continue to do that. And that might be the best hope at the end of the day.
Thank you so much for being with us. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. JAUHAR SALEEM, thank you for joining us. NADER ALTURK, thank you for being with us today. Dr. Ahmed Zaki, thank you for your time. Overall, of course, there are, the world understands that this conflict must be contained, and the world understands for that it needs to be more organized in its efforts to counter the kind of aggression, the kind of offensives, the kind of escalation that we've seen from the Israeli side. We've also seen the recent initiative from Saudi Arabia in that regard, and of course the world needs to unite on that one goal. Let's hope that we can work towards that. Let's hope that we can do that so that there is that kind of enormous pressure that leaves no choice for the Israelis to understand that this needs to stop right now, the barbarity and the kind of inhumanity that we are looking at every day. Thank you so much for joining us today on Perspective.